Okay, so pick up where we left off. We had just gone through some preliminaries giving an idea as to how radiation inflicts its effect. I discussed chromosome aberrations as being one important surrogate, if not the actual damaging event.
You could use this to advance and go back.
Oh, does that actually work? Oh, to advance. Oh, okay.
Don't press that button. Did you press that?
No, well, almost. Oh, yeah, that's fine. Good.
Wait a minute. There you go.
All right, so
Want me
then,
to put you on full screen?
yeah, probably a good idea.
There you go. There you go, Phil.
And then use these two buttons.
That goes back. Oh, wait a minute.
Some weird mode there.
See, that goes in mouse mode. So then get that off there and you click that. Now you're in viewgraph mode. Don't ever touch that button.
Don't ever touch it. Yeah. Okay. The point of no return. Okay. All right. Yeah. So I had laid down a few preliminaries as to how to think about translation of radiation into an endpoint of interest, and then how to quantify that. So you can get the direct line from radiation to mediating effect to final effect. And then I want to now translate some of that background into the prospect of risk estimation. Let's see, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. So what we see is that cell transformation is the sort of the flip side of cell killing. At larger doses, the effect of radiation is predominantly cell killing. So while, as we know, radiation is also a mutagenic agent, what we hope for, at least, is that we have killed cells so that if you're, it's sort of like the competing causes of death kind of thing. If a mutated but killed cell is like unimportant. So if all goes well in a therapeutic context, mutated cells wouldn't be a problem. But certainly at lower doses, we can't necessarily hope for that. And then the lower doses, of course, are of interest in not only space radiation risk, but even here at home, where we're interested in workplace exposures of radiation and radon exposures and the like, where the effects here are largely unknown, but certainly the prospect for at least carcinogenesis. But fortunately, what we've learned here does have a lot of application to the problem of risk. So what I'm going to talk about here is radiation risk of solid cancers is one paradigm, realizing that, again, there are multiple endpoints to be concerned about in the radiation risk, and discuss some of the epidemiological, statistical, and phenomenological calculations that go into measuring it. To remind you, cancer risk is a stochastic concept, just as is cell killing. But there are some very important differences. In the case of cancer risk, there's a very low probability event at the cell level. For every hit cell, the possibility of it become carcinogenic is quite remote compared to if you hit the same cell with a moderate dose of radiation and ask about killing. And in carcinogenesis, it's going to be the first event that matters. Subsequent events to neighboring cells and so on is less important, because once a cancer originates, you're considered to be a cancer case regardless of any possible additional transforming events. So that's another thing to consider. But nonetheless, the concept of survival, as discussed with no lethal lesions having occurred within cells, carries over logically to a carcinogenesis risk where we talk about no transforming events having occurred within a cell. Now, these risks I'm going to discuss include of course, you have the early effects, such as radiation sickness, which can show up hours, days, or a few weeks after a high exposure. These are, of course, better understood because you have the luxury of seeing the result soon after the initiating event has happened. A little more troublesome are these late effects, leukemia, cataracts, and the CNS and cardiovascular effects, in addition to cancers, where, because they show up years, even decades after the event, making the association between cause and effect is much more difficult. Compounding that is the fact that at these very low doses, the frequency of the initiating events themselves are not all that great. So, so between the two, you have a pretty formidable problem where you have to do a lot of estimation by inference using such epidemiologic data as from the A-bomb survivors and a few animal experiments where you make somewhat iffy translations of effect from one setting to another. The way this is done is we consider, like, the excess relative risk is a common term used, and what that refers to is the excess risk over the background incidence. So one always has to remember that the excess relative risk isn't the chance of getting cancer, it's the additional chance of getting the cancer above background. So when you look at these numbers, they'll tend to be a little bit sort of shockingly large, but consider that the denominator itself is small, so one should just take that into account when thinking about these numbers. Here's a annual incidence plot. This is the, whoops, sorry about that. This is the annual incidence per 1,000 males per year as a function of age. And one sees that, of course, background incidence of cancers increases with age, no surprise. But then decelerates as you get above around 60 or so. A number of reasons have been offered for that, such as frailty effects, where if you're going to get cancers, you will have gotten them by a certain age, so what remains is a more robust population, so on. A lot of explanations for the shape of this, but suffice to say it does increase till about age 80, and then perhaps, but not conclusively, actually decreases beyond that. So the approaches to risk estimation are a couple. The one most commonly used for the purposes of actual policy making is the statistical phenomenological estimation approach. One here considers the annual excess relative risk, as discussed, the ERR over background cancer incidence, and they take that to be, in effect, a formula like as shown there, the excess relative risk being a product of two inputs, A being the decidedly radiogenic contribution. It depends on dose rate, radiation quality effects. You've heard about these things. While B considers the organ-specific, tissue-specific effects that have to be sort of put in as corrective factors to what one determines from the more average effects reflected in A. Then, more recently, hasn't gained an official policy foothold yet, is this notion of biologically based risk estimation. What this entails is thinking more mechanistically rather than statistically and phenomenologically about the problem. But in the course of doing that, introducing into the equation a lot more effects, a lot more sort of, I mean, at least from the beginning of this exercise, a lot more sort of confounding influences. One has to consider interactions among cells. One has to consider, say, cell cycle effects and so on, where just the sheer parameterization can be overwhelming. But as I'll discuss at the end, some of this can be streamlined into sort of major effects to be considered that can lend themselves to some simplification and enlighten our understanding a bit more. So, as for the form of A, which is a radiogenic term, maybe you won't be surprised to see that this alpha D plus beta G D squared surfaces again. The logic being somewhat similar. The term alpha D refers to one-track action initiating carcinogenesis, and the beta G D squared refers to the possibility of two-track interactions affecting the rate of carcinogenesis. Now here, instead of thinking of lethal lesions, one thinks of non-lethal chromosome aberrations. Remember those ones I colored black in the original diagram, not the red ones, but the black ones, the symmetric translocations, the inversions and so on, which aren't themselves lethal, but what they can do is in the course of remending, create mutations at the site of remending. One classic case of that's not a radiogenic case, but it's illustrative, is the case of chronic myeloid leukemia, where one has the BCR-ABL fusion protein formed by what amounts to an exchange between, I think, chromosomes 9 and 22, which is the single defining event in the course of that leukemia. But that's considered at least suggestive information concerning the posed translation between chromosome aberrations and carcinogenesis. It's the one most often used, I guess, to sort of make that argument. So with that, again, as sort of our paradigm for induction of our endpoint here, carcinogenesis, one can think about, well, what's the chances of a cell surviving transformation, surviving becoming a cancer, right? Same model. It's still that exponential of that form, but now we're talking about what's the chance of cancer elicitation, right? So if we take 1 minus that, okay, it's the probability of cancer elicitation. And then remembering that now the alpha D minus beta GD squared is a small number, because again, per unit of radiation now, the incidence of induction of carcinogenesis is very small. We're talking, 10 to the minus 12th or 11th. I mean, we're really talking small here. So obviously we can just make this approximation here that just the rate of generation of these aberrations equates to the risk. 1 minus exponential of that small number is just the alpha D plus beta GD squared. Hence, that's sort of in brief how the relationship for A came about. So, okay, so then how does this B modifier work? Well, B takes into account the organ involved and other biologically specific contributions, gender, cohort properties. Yep.
This is random aside, I guess, but does it vary based on your metabolism as well? Like if you have a faster metabolism, your cells are going to regenerate a little quicker. So then would your chances of getting cancer increase or decrease? Well, probably increase, if anything.
Well, there's a connection between being overweight and getting cancer. If to the extent they're having a lower metabolism, I guess you would have a case then.
So it doesn't so they're basically metabolic effects are just not considered such, don't really matter. They're negligible.
I don't know if it's been directly considered. It's sort of harder to categorize people on that basis. And
Sure.
Access to that information is a little less obvious than age and sex and all that.
Right.
So we haven't worked our way down to there yet, but at the end I'm going to discuss things we maybe should be working down to get a better handle on what amounts to this B coefficient. Okay, so for now, in terms of the phenomenological modeling, B is often estimated using data on A-bomb survivors for, in answer to your question, sort of a paucity of data we can get our hands on in the human area. I mean, obviously you can't expose people or anything. So anyway, this data set's been studied fairly thoroughly, and what we've somewhat learned from this is, well, amongst that is the following. This is the predicted excess relative risk versus years since radiation for breast cancer. This assumes the woman is exposed, I think, at 30 years of age, and then looks at years since then. And again, this is the excess relative risk. It peaks at 10 years, as you can see, and then drops. Now, that's not to say the actual cancer incidence decreases in these women, because again, remember, the denominator is the background risk, right, which is at 40 years, for example, is about 0.1%, but then 15 years afterwards actually jumps to about 3 times that. So these curves, in terms of cancer incidence, are actually increasing. But this this gives you an idea of how this picture looks like in terms of the excess risk. One can go on an NIH website and see more of these statistics shown there at the bottom if you want to know more about this. Yeah, I should say that this was standardized to an acute dose of 1 gray. So the excess risk is you're talking on the order of 50% or so beyond background due to a 1 gray exposure. Yeah.
I was wondering if there's a explanation for why there's a decrease of the risk after, like with number. I would assume that it would flat out.
Well, offhand, it could be a frailty effect, where there could be a little bit of a predetermination for radiogenic risk, and then that, if that doesn't materialize a certain number of years into, and then perhaps you're a little.
Yeah, I
less
can
likely.
understand how it's low in the
Yeah.
initial years and take some time to build up, but then I'm trying to understand why it actually decreases
Yeah.
from the peak.
Well, that's what I'm offering. That
Okay.
if you're going to get it as a result of exposure, perhaps you'll get it earlier on for most people, and then the remaining perhaps are less inclined to get it, and that's what you're seeing 15, 20 years out, are those women who perhaps are. That's one possibility. But that's a usefulness of this scene of sort of fleshing out effects like that. See, there's something, but needless to say, those are hotly debated things. I get there's several reasons offered for that effect. So that's the instantaneous excess relative risk at a certain number of years after exposure for that next year. One can then discuss, as Frank mentioned, looking at the lifetime excess relative risk. Here, you introduce additional concerns. One now has to think about competing causes of death as limiting the excess relative risk one would experience from the radiogenic exposure. Here would be a sample way one would maybe calculate something like that. If you think about the background cancer risk is B of T, and the competing causes of death of C, then the denominator of this function up here is, you'll recognize that exponential function there is that same thing we've been talking about a lot, that B plus C is the totality of the causes of death, right? So then the exponential relates to, well, neither cause of background cancer mortality has happened in the time t, but then suppose it happens in the next increment of t, the background cancer, that's the front B of t in the denominator, and the next delta t, then you integrate over all those things. So then the denominator is sort of the lifetime background cancer risk. It could be for mortality or it could be for incidence, actually either endpoint. It's obviously the respective function applies. In the numerator, one's doing the same thing now, but now you're saying, okay, suppose up to time t, no cause of death has occurred. So that includes the background cancer, radiogenic cancer, and death from other causes C. None of that has occurred up to time t. But then in the next increment, we consider the excess relative risk of the radiogenic cancer and integrate that over time. And then the ratio of that then gives you, the excess relative risk for the lifetime radiation exposure. So that's basically how those kind of things are calculated. Here you see, as you'd expect, the lifetime mortality risk as a function of age at exposure diminishes with age because, of course, if you're exposed at 80, the chances you're going to succumb to cancer versus a heart attack or something else is, vanishingly small. So, okay, so, so statistically, what do we see? Okay, well, if you look at these solid cancers, these are from the ABOM data from a work by Preston. We see there's a lot of organ specificity in cancer generation. So this gets into that discussion you've already heard about, where one has to consider, quality factors that relate to the organ of interest. So naturally, NASA's focused on a few important instances, lung and breast being among them, as being those associated with a relatively high excess relative risk. Here you're seeing excess relative risk per sievert. You'll see you're looking at 0.5 there. This sounds alarmingly high again, but consider two things. That's the excess relative risk per sievert. The ABOM survivors, got on average considerably less than that. But again, also you're talking about the excess relative risk over the background risk, which is, in this case, with solid cancers, you were looking at tracking about 100,000 people, and of all solid cancers, you're talking about 10,000 mortalities of solid cancer. So you're talking about already a small fraction, then of which a fraction of that was radiogenic. So in the net, I think you're looking at about 500 cases or so out of about 100,000 that you're thinking it can be attributable to radiation. So when all is said and done here, then these risk numbers aren't nearly as bad as they would seem. But suffice to say, we do have to think about organ specificity in these analyses. Okay, well, what about high LET? I haven't said much directly about that other than to say it's densely ionizing, but what does that mean in terms of the putative carcinogenic lesion? Well, what you see here, in the case of protons and iron nuclei, what one tends to see is highly clustered damage, that the particle takes a more or less straight line track through the cells. You can sort of see that on the right-hand side. The damages are numerous and closely aligned, so that you get, in terms of the chromosome aberrations, these complex lesions where you get one break, you get several breaks, sometimes in these chromosomes, which obviously greatly enhance the prospect for mutagenesis and carcinogenesis. Whereas in the low LET case, the sparsely ionizing case, that's the one we, yes?
At that point, wouldn't the cell just kill itself to build off cases? Because it's just so like massive. So what are the chances of becoming mutagenic as opposed to just...
It's probably more often lethal than not.
Yeah.
But if in this case, if the cell isn't killed, it's much more at risk per surviving cell. So then that makes it a more of a concern for that reason, an offsetting effect there. On the left, we see the more familiar case where the standard expectation would be a more simple chromosome aberration. Okay, so then, given that high LET is harder to get at, we can only imagine what's going on at high LET, certainly in the human case, and the animal data too is now forthcoming, but it's still largely waited for. What's been going on up until now is inferring high LET risk from data such as the A-bomb survivor data, and the way that works is as follows. Imagine these plots of our surrogate, the frequency of aberrant cells, and we depict here the typical case for the high LET and low LET with respect to the expression of the surrogate, and they do follow the expected patterns of being more or less linear given the densely ionizing nature of the high LET radiation, and then forms that rather nicely the parabolic shape, the alpha plus beta G d squared shape for the low LET. Now, in terms of the surrogate, we can infer, as Frank discussed, a relative biological effectiveness between the low and high LET radiation. Now, suppose we have this surrogate chromosome aberrations and we have these plots, so we can form the RBEs at any dose we want to. Then we also have low LET cancer data, imagine. Then we can, by using these surrogates and the RBEs, make some inferences as to the cancer risk for the high LET given the low LET. So it's by sort of an indirect approach here. And so in this case, at the set point where we're looking at the frequency of aberrant cells, 10%, we see we have a dose RBE between these two sets of data, roughly, looks like about 4. Okay, so then one would translate the risk accordingly, just using the surrogate, with the faith that the surrogate is actually a reliable translator of the risk. In the limit, one can think of the RBE max in the low dose limit where imagine that red line, that top horizontal line, getting lower and lower and lower. Right now you see the RBE starts to increase when you do that, just by virtue of the shapes of the curve, until you start getting down to the point where they both are more or less linear, right near the origin down there, where you start approaching RBE max. But at that location, both curves are taking a more or less linear behavior. So this calculation now is somewhat simplified. We can translate this second to last equation here, LET-ER a dose T equals the low LET-ER a dose D times RBE. That was the one relevant to the more moderate doses. Now we can pull out the RBE from the right-hand side because the right-hand side has effectively become linear, so everything becomes proportional. You can get away with that. So then that bottom expression just tells you that if you know the values of the surrogates at a given dose between the low and high LET radiation, you can infer an RBE max, and then infer, if you know from the RBE max, infer from low dose carcinogenesis risk in the low LET realm what it might be in the high LET realm. Is that clear what I'm saying? So you're making a low to high LET conversion of your estimated risk, and that's one way it's done statistically. Keller and Walsh suggest maybe we should take a more direct approach. One infers RBE as before, but in going to the low dose realm, instead of doing the RBE max approach and sliding down the parabolic curve to meet the densely ionizing curve, instead just go straight over and slide down instead the densely ionizing curve, which is straight. So if you extrapolate that down to low doses, that's just a linear extrapolation. So that's one alternative suggestion we have for estimating the low dose risk in the high LET realm. So what have we learned here? Well, cancer is a late risk, which has complicated its assessment. We don't have the benefit of we cause cancer and then say, okay, it happens a day later, and so we have a quick endpoint to see what happened. We have to wait. We have to understand the intervening events, which I'm going to get back to here just shortly. Risk is measured as a perturbation to background cancer incidence. So in terms of the practical aspects of just how dangerous it is to go in space and so on, we have adopted this terminology where, well, you have a certain chance of getting cancer whether you do anything or not. So in terms of putting things in proper perspective, one thinks about, well, how much more cancer am I going to get? So that's a concept that's gotten reasonable credibility just on the basis of making the argument more practical. Then I mentioned the current standards for measurement are mostly phenomenological at present, and that in particular high LET risk estimation is done often indirectly using more plentiful data in the low LET realm, and then through RBEs and other constructs making an inference crossing over to the high LET realm. But one confounder to this idea that I was promised I would get back to, is that we have to consider larger scales of action in all of this, right? A concept driving a lot of the modeling is that cancer is an inherently cellular concept. You create a lesion, an initiating lesion in cells, it accumulates enough mutations to cause a cellular transformation, and that cell, having transformed, ends the discussion. Now it's just a matter of time, a latency time before that cell becomes manifest disease. Right? But certain things are hinting that this may be a grossly distorted picture, this idea that bystander effects and adaptive responses can put a larger scale input into the problem beyond cellular. So now we're talking, tens and maybe hundreds of micron scale now instead. So yeah, the bystander and adaptive responses being one glaring sort of hint at this this question of intercellular effects. Which brings us to what we focus on mainly today in our group, is this notion of tissue-level effects in carcinogenesis. One important motivation for this line of thinking is that we all, or most of us, are in fact cancer carriers, believe it or not. As we have dug deeper and deeper into our ability to resolve lesions in tissues using ever better and better techniques, we're finding that more and more of us are actually carrying lesions that maybe many of us won't even realize we have. Right? So these are pathologically confirmed cancers. This is I'm thinking of a publication by Black and Welsh in the New England Journal. You can look it up. These lesions they're discovering are frank cancers, but in terms of statistics, it's clear that they're not going to show up in a person's lifetime unless there is a precipitating event that causes these cancers to awaken. So what we're seeing here, this left half of the curve is sort of the classic model. Look at the top curve. That the top curve is saying, this is this one right here, goes up like this, that you have initiation, which predisposes the cell to become cancer. Then you get a final transformation. And then in terms of risk, a lot of the modeling said, okay, everything is said and done. Now we just have to wait for the progression to happen. But it will happen, and there will be a case. Okay. Now the thinking is, in fact, at the point of transformation, the risk is actually very low, because these tumors, for one reason or another, can't break through a tissue-level constraint. There's some population-level constraints that somehow impose further plateau points that the tissue then has to breach. Okay, one of these we've been studying is the angiogenic competency barrier. Okay, these appear to represent a good deal of these tumors that Black and Welsh uncovered. These tumors are sitting there churning, proliferating and dying in place at about 1 millimeter in diameter, but they're avascular. Okay, they can't conjure up the vasculature to take off. Now, it could be that radiation is a prime switcher of that process. We've been studying the role of radiation-induced angiogenesis in a model of dormant cancer and found that in the case of gamma radiation, the angiogenic process can be expedited. And we've seen actual releases from dormancy of tumors implanted in models where, in mice where they start out as a dormant clone and then transform into a proangiogenic, fast-growing clone. So we've studied that phenomenon. So in the case of gamma radiation in separate experiments, we found that the putative angiogenic basis for that is advanced. But curiously, and it's just preliminary data, proton radiation looks like it might suppress this process. It might actually interfere with the acquisition of angiogenesis, at least in terms, at the gene level, that seems to be what's happening. But obviously a lot more work needs to be done on that, because that comes as a surprise to everybody given the similar track structures of protons and gamma rays at the nanometer level. Given that they're both exciting fast electrons, why would there be a difference? Well, again, the reason there might be a difference is because maybe we're looking at the wrong scale. Maybe we have to start thinking about intercellular effects. And where that's really obvious is at the level of iron nuclei, where you have penumbral ranges that can extend over a number of cells. These are huge penumbral ranges in the case of iron. So the case is even more dramatic for thinking about these larger scales and what consequent cell-cell interactions can determine, even after at the cell level we have a carcinogenic event. So with that, leaving you to think about that,
I've got a question.
Yes.
This came up earlier about white blood cells, the immune system, T to B cell ratios, and things like that. In other words, radiation may be influencing not only the DNA and these organs, but
The inflammatory process generally.
depressing the repair mechanisms. And is that under the mechanistic theory, is that being considered? Or aren't you there yet?
Well, I mean, people are looking at the effect of radiation on just these, like the immune system generally.
Yeah.
They've discovered such things as the stem cells seem to have an inherent resistance to radiation compared to the progeny of those cells. Perhaps evolutionarily for that very reason, that you don't want every random event to upset you at the stem cell level. But conversely, once a mutation event does make it to the stem cell, then all of its progeny is going to have that problem. So again, it's sort of an all or none thing, but so that's heavily researched.
But
They're looking at for controls. Is it a reactive oxygen generation control? It appears that stem cells also have some resistance to that too, perhaps because that is a potential inducer of carcinogenesis, sort of evolutionarily speaking. And
okay, but it's not in the models or thought about in terms of if you had a healthy immune system, that is, you could tolerate a much higher dosage of radiation, of certain types of radiation, versus the radiation that could affect materially the immune system. Follow me on that?
well, it's more of the response, the immune response to the tissue, the target tissue of immune interest, than it is
Right.
immune system per se. I think at the doses we're talking about, such as in cardiac especially, that one has to think about the immune reaction to the to damaging events on the level of the cardiac endothelium, the cardiac vessel walls, for example. Whereas actually David Gukasian, I guess, is looking at endothelial progenitor cells and the effect of damage to them, what that might mean for the repair of the vascular walls in the heart and so on, and the propagation of damage should it occur to all of the progeny of those cells as it continues to repair tissue. So if you keep damaging tissue, you keep potentially repairing it with mutated cells, and then you have the prospect of amplifying your damage.
Disaster, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the stem cells is the key to understanding of it.
Yeah, this is just out of curiosity. Are infants more able to repair DNA damage than adults, or are adults more able to repair DNA damage than infants? Did you study that in animal models?
I don't know. Let's see if the function. I guess I haven't heard so much an age dependence, is it?
I think in some sense, Fred Burns had some data.
In some sense, they do, because Fred Burns had data showing that in rats, that younger rats could repair DNA damage better.
Younger rats?
But younger rats have a higher risk of cancer. So,
So the two aren't quite offsetting, I guess.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now you have defects in repair, the ataxia-telangiectasia. I mean, there are defects in DNA repair that coincide with higher cancer incidence. If you're wondering about the connection, there's certainly, in terms of some of these syndromes, there's a direct connection between the ability to repair DNA and then the susceptibility to cancer. Yep.
You were mentioning earlier the different rates of exposure in acute and sort of long term. I was wondering if an astronaut, for example, is going to receive a certain amount of sieverts or a certain amount of radiation over a certain time period, like a month, is there a function that would minimize their cancer risk? Is the best way to do it to have a flat, sort of rough level of radiation, or is there some kind of a function that would actually, is the flat the optimum, or is some kind of a fractionated exposure going to lower your risk?
Well, yeah, I suppose just carrying this analogy here with the killing analogy forward to the mutational analogy, depends on the radiation type. I mean, but it would seem, at least for sparsely ionizing radiations, that would be true, that a more protracted regimen would be better. But then other effects come in, like an adaptive response. If you give a priming dose, for example, a low priming dose, and then hit it with a substantial dose just after the priming dose in effect inoculated you against a lot of the deleterious effects of the other dose. So in that sense, I mean, the prior dose exposure can be beneficial, at least. That introduces another argument to it, the adaptive response, which has to do with cellular reaction to the prior exposure as sort of an inoculation. But in answer to your question, I think more protracted would therefore be a better, at least for the sparsely ionizing case. Hmm?